The Super Nintendo was a huge part of many of our lives, still remaining plenty of people's favorite console of all time. If you were a Nintendo fan back in the day, going into the SNES from the NES was magical. We had larger sprites, more colorful games, bigger and more complex stories were told. There are plenty of games from that era that hold up to this day, and if were released today as retro-inspired titles having never existed then, I'd imagine people would still love them. I'd argue the Super Nintendo never died. It remains a big part of my life, but for sure, just like any other console, it had an end of retail life. The next generation of consoles comes out and companies forget about the previous. Nintendo, they were focused on the Nintendo 64, and third parties were working on games for it, and, the PlayStation as well, among other consoles. It's interesting to look back through the history of games for a console, and the Super Nintendo, the history of games that I played, I can usually pinpoint to specific interactions I had with friends, things going on in the world, that kind of stuff. The system left a lasting impression on me, and while I was ready for the next generation at the time, unfortunately the magic of the Super Nintendo wasn't quite replicated in Nintendo's next offering. I do have tons of memories of the Nintendo 64, enjoyed many of the games for it, but no doubt with the shift in the gaming world towards disc-based media and a lot of third-party companies leaving Nintendo behind, we weren't getting the same amount of awesomeness for the N64. I remember leaning back to the Super Nintendo at the time for a while until I embraced the PlayStation 1, but I don't remember playing too many of the later release titles for the Super Nintendo. Now, not the final release games for it anyway, but that got me thinking recently. What was the final released official Super Nintendo game? Sure, we still get games made by companies today for retro consoles, but I was curious, what did I ignore at the end of its retail life cycle? Obviously, some could say, hey, Star Fox 2 was the final released Super Nintendo game, and sure, I kinda get that, but, with it being released in 2017 on an official emulation console, it's a neat piece of Nintendo history and an awesome little throwback for many people, but yeah, it wasn't an actual retail released game for the Super Nintendo. I feel the NES and Super Nintendo classics caused a big uptick in interest in retro gaming. Lots of people getting these devices and, reliving their past. I think they wound up wanting to explore more options and kind of get a little deeper into it. I think a lot of people probably wound up wanting to rebuy the original consoles and get some games during that time period when these little classic consoles came out. Now, I do love stuff like that. There have been plenty of devices in the past that have reinvigorated my desire to get back into retro gaming at certain points. But let's get back to the topic at hand. Each region of the world had its final release games, some more going out with a bang than others. In Japan, you have it a little more unclear on how you may approach what was the final release game. I mean, kind of a gray area thing here, but let's get into it. So, Japan, they actually had an official flash cartridge for the Super Famicom, the Nintendo Power. This was first introduced in 1996, and there was a Game Boy version as well that was released in 2000. This seems to have been a way to allow retailers to keep more dedicated space for newer hardware and games while still showing support for, the previous system, still being able to make some money off of them, right? This service was interesting as you would purchase the RAM cart, the little flash cart, and you would buy games at the store to be loaded onto the cartridge. It said that the retailers, they were shipped physical manuals for the titles that were offered through that kiosk, and when you purchased a game to be loaded onto the cart, they would give you the manual for that title. Thought that was kind of cool. Also, depending on the size of the game would dictate how many titles you could have on one cartridge. So not just one game, you could have multiple games. It's a very neat idea for the time, in my opinion, and crazy to think that the service lasted all the way up to 2007. It was discontinued in Japan just a few months after the Wii was released. Now, in Japan, the final released physical cartridge, this is not up for debate, was Fire Emblem Thracia 776. Came out on January 21st, 2000, but it wasn't the final released official title. A lot of the final titles in Japan were released via that Nintendo Power kiosk system. Before Fire Emblem, a title that I found interesting that was among the final release games was Columns. The game came out for the Super Famicom in 1999. I remember Columns being a game I only played on Sega hardware, so kind of cool, seeing the Sega copyright on a Super Famicom game. Now, the final 2 official games released for the Super Famicom in Japan were done through that Nintendo Power kiosk, and they were Picross Nintendo Power Volume 8, which came out in June of 2000, and Metal Slayer Glory Director's Cut in November of 2000. Both were first-party titles, and I find this kind of interesting how the last days of the Super Famicom looked in Japan. Kind of interesting with that flash cartridge kiosk thing. Now, in Europe, their final title was Timon and Pumbaa's Jungle Games in 1998, which was also the year that we would see the final release game in the US. Japan not only had their version of the Super Nintendo before us, but it also lasted longer as well, with releases coming out later. Thought that was kind of interesting. Now, in the US, what we got was not the send-off I'd have hoped for, but at least previous years could define the console instead of its last title. Now, I'm not talking down on the final official first-party game, as it was not the final release for the system, not in physical cartridge format, but Nintendo's last title that they published was Kirby's Dream Land 3. Not my favorite of the Kirby series, but I do think it would have been a better send-off than what the final retail game was. Now, kind of interesting that Kirby's Dream Land was released in the USA first, and then it came out in Japan, and never released on the Super Nintendo in Europe. It wasn't released in Europe until the Wii Virtual Console in 2009 anyway. But okay, our final game released in the USA was Frogger. On October 6, 1998, Majesco gave us the final game, an extremely lazy port of a retro classic. The game only had one stage that continues to get harder and harder, with new enemies and obstacles being introduced, and everything winds up moving slightly faster the further you progress. Now, there's only 8 stages. They do repeat once you complete the game, and when you repeat the game, it keeps some of the later enemies in it, so kind of like a new game plus type thing. Pretty lazy all in all, and the first time I played it, I thought I was playing a Game Boy Color game via emulation. The game just sucks. I mean, there's really only one level. That's it. One stage. It has horrible hit detection, and it's void of any music. Just the little frog hopping sound. I mean, maybe there were worse games for the Super Nintendo. I mean, let me know if you know of any in the comments down below. But yeah, that was a pretty embarrassing release, and it sucks that it gets the title of final, release game for the Super Nintendo. Not the greatest offering. Not the way I would, hope the Super Nintendo is remembered by, and I don't think it is anyway. I mean, it's just a crappy game put out by a crappy company that lacked any kind of polish. Just like, hey, let's make a little bit of money on this little cheap game we programmed in a weekend type of thing. But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Really do appreciate every single one of y'all. And with that said, I will catch you on the next one. Bye!